بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. In this lesson we're going to try and complete the third and final mas'ala from the third subchapter في الهدي وأحكامه. We're going to speak about the hadi and some of its rulings. What is al-hadi? The authors here, they mention الهدي ما يهدى إلى البيت الحرام من بهيمة الأنعام الإبل والبقر والغنم تقربا إلى الله تعالى. Al-Hadi refers to the sacrifice that a person offers to the sacred sanctuary in order to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he sacrifices either a camel or a cow, a sheep or a goat at the sacred sanctuary. And this is something which is done in order to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what we're going to be speaking about. Anwa'ul hadi, types of hadi. The first type, hadi tamattu' wal qiran. The first type is the hadi that is offered by the person who is performing hajj tamattu' as well as the one who is performing hajj al-qiran. So there's three forms of hajj. There's hajj tamattu', hajj al-qiran and hajj al-ifrad. Hajj tamattu' and hajj al-qiran, both of these, they perform umrah and hajj. They perform umrah and hajj. The difference between the two is that the person performing hajj tamattu', he performs Umrah during the months of Hajj, which is Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah. So firstly he performs Umrah, completes Umrah, then comes out of the state of Ihram. And then once Hajj begins, he assumes Ihram again and then he performs Hajj. So he is performing Umrah and Hajj separately. The Qarin, the person who performs Hajj al-Qiran, he combines between Umrah and Hajj at the same time. He's going to perform both Umrah and Hajj in one go. And then the Mufrid is the one who performs Hajj alone. So here what we're saying is, these two, they offer a sacrifice. As part of their Hajj, they sacrifice the Hadi. And it's wajib upon them to perform this as long as they are not from the residents of Mecca and the residents of the Haram in particular. If they're not from the residents, that's when it becomes wajib upon them. But if they are from the residents, then it's not wajib, even if they are performing Tamattu' or Hajj Qiran, as they mention here. وَهُوَ وَاجِبٌ عَلَى مَنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ حَاضِرِ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ. And it is wajib, this type of hadi, this type of sacrifice upon the mutamatti' al-qiran, as long as they are not from the residents of the sacred sanctuary and the surrounding area. وَهُوَ دَمُ نُسُكٍ لَا جُبْرَانٍ. And this type of sacrifice is a sacrifice that is offered as a ritual. It's a ritual and a rite of Hajj. It's not an expiatory sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice because someone is penalized for falling into a prohibition or missing out a mandatory act. And some of the scholars, they say, huwa damu shukran. It's a sacrifice where a person, he does so in order to show gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing him to complete Umrah and Hajj. So what's the evidence for this, that they have to sacrifice? The evidence, لقوله تعالى فَمَنْ تَمَتَّعَ بِالْعُمْرَةِ إِلَى الْحَجِّ فَمَا اسْتَيْسَرَ مِنَ الْهَدِي. So whoever is going to take a break between Umrah and Hajj, they have to offer whatever sacrificial animal they can afford. So here the ayah mentions taking a break between Umrah and Hajj, that is Hajj al-Tamattu', where there's a pause, separation between Umrah and Hajj. The scholars, they did qiyas, they use analogy to include al-Qarin, because al-Qarin also he is performing Umrah and Hajj. Even though there's no break in between, he is still performing Umrah and Hajj. And sometimes the Qarin, he is referred to as being mutamatti'. They refer to him as being mutamatti' in the fact that he is combining between Umrah and Hajj. So the scholars, they use this ayah as evidence that it's wajib upon the person who is able from the mutamatti' and the Qarin to offer whatever sacrifice they can. And the minimum is per person a sheep, or 1/7 of a cow, or 1/7 of a camel. So they don't have to offer a full camel or a full cow. 1/7 of these two and one sheep per person. What if a person is unable to offer that? They cannot afford it. Here they speak about that. فَإِنْ عَدِمَ الْهَدْيُ أَوْ ثَمَنُهُ صَامَ 3 أيام في الحج ويجوز صيامها في أيام التشريق وسبعة إذا رجع إلى أهله لقوله تعالى فمن لم يجد فصيام 3 أيام في الحج وسبعة إذا رجعتم. If a person is unable, the mutamatti' or the qarin, he is unable to find a sacrificial animal, or he is unable to afford a sacrificial animal, then he has to fast a total of 10 days. 3 of these 10 days have to be fasted during pilgrimage. They have to be fasted during pilgrimage. And the scholars, they differ when can one start fasting these 3 days. Some of them, they said as soon as he assumes ihram to perform umrah, that's when he can start fasting. And some of them said he can fast it 3 days before Arafah. And there is a concession for this type of person. If he hasn't already fasted, then he can utilize the 3 days of at-tashriq. It's permissible, and he is the only one who's given this exemption to fast on ayyam at-tashriq. The general rule is that fasting ayyam at-tashriq, which is the 11th, 12th and 13th of Dhul Hijjah, is generally impermissible, because these 3 days are days of Eid, as the Prophet ﷺ said, ayyamu aklin wa shurb. They are days of eating and drinking and remembrance of Allah. It's not allowed to fast, generally speaking. But for this type of person who cannot find a sacrificial animal, he is allowed to utilize these 3 days to fast those 3 days which he has to fast while in pilgrimage. And that's what they mention here. Jews, it's permissible for them. And this is the only time where it's permissible to fast, ayyam at-tashriq. So he has to fast 3 days while in pilgrimage, and then the remaining 7 he does so once he returns back to his country of residence after Hajj. And the evidence for this is the saying of Allah, whoever is unable or does not find a sacrificial animal, then he has to fast 3 days during pilgrimage and 7 upon his return. Al-Baqarah, ayah 196. وَيُسْتَحَبُّ لِلْحَاجِّ أَنْ يَأْكُلَ مِنْ هَدْيِ التَّمَتُّعِ وَالْقِرَانِ. And it's recommended for the person who slaughters the hadi, in the case of the mutamatti' and the qarin, that they eat from their sacrificial animal. It's recommended because of the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَكُلُوا مِنْهَا وَأَطْعِمُوا الْقَانِعَ وَالْمُعْتَرِ. So eat from it and feed the needy, those who do not beg and those who beg, feed them as well. So this is the first type, the hadi that is offered by the mutamatti' and the qarin as part of their rites of Hajj. The second type of hadi is hadyu al-jubran. Hadyu al-jubran is an expiatory hadi that has to be offered. وهو الفدية الواجبة لترك واجب أو ارتكاب محظور من محظورات الإحرام. And this hadi, the expiatory hadi or sacrificial animal that is offered here, is in the case where a person is compensating because they have left off an obligatory act, or they've committed a prohibited act from the prohibited acts of ihram that we mentioned. Or بسبب الإحصار, or this expiatory sacrifice is offered for one who is unable to complete his umrah or hajj. Person has assumed ihram, but for one reason or another he is obstructed from completing his umrah and hajj. We mentioned previously that it is wajib when a person begins umrah or hajj that he completes it, as Allah said, وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ. But if for one reason or another the person is unable to complete his umrah or hajj, then he has to offer a sacrifice. So here they say, أو بسبب الإحصار عند وجود سببه. So when there is a reason that prevents him from completing the umrah or hajj, he has to offer a sacrifice. And this reason may be because there's enemy, there is he becomes sick, or he runs out of funds, and so on. The evidence for this, that he has to offer a sacrifice, is the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَإِنْ أُحْسِرْتُمْ فَمَا اسْتَيْسَرَ مِنَ الْهَدِي. If you are prevented or obstructed, then you have to offer whatever sacrificial animal you can afford. And this is also in the same ayah. So they're using the same ayah 196, but mentioning the different parts for the different masail, the different issues. And likewise, so this is evidence for al-ihsar, and the evidence that if you miss a wajib act and you commit a prohibition, that you have to offer a sacrifice. The evidence for that is the fatwa that was given by Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, which majority of the scholars have taken and applied. وَلِقَوْلِ Ibn Abbas مَنْ نَسِيَ مِنْ نُسُكِهِ شَيْءٍ. Whoever forgets a rite from the rites of Hajj, أَوْ تَرَكَهُ, or leaves it off, فَلْيُرِقْ دَمَا, then he has to offer a sacrifice. طيب وهذا النوع لا يجوز الأكل منه. This type of sacrifice is not permissible for the person to eat from it. It's not permissible because this is a penalty. This is different from the first type where we said you're allowed to eat. This one you do not eat because this is an expiation. بل يتصدق به على فقراء الحرم. The meat, it should be distributed to the poor of the haram. So that's the second type. The third type, هدي التطوع, the recommended hadi. And this includes the mufrid, the one who performs hajj alone. It's recommended for him to offer hadi as well for them. But in the case of the mutamatti and the qarin, it's wajib. And likewise, it's recommended for a person performing umrah. This is a forgotten sunnah during these days of Dhul Hijjah, the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, from Eid 11, 12 and 14. These 4 days, he should offer a sacrificial animal. And likewise, anyone who is not a pilgrim and not a person performing umrah, whether he is inside the haram or outside of the haram, it's also recommended for them to offer this sacrifice. And if they are outside of the haram, they would send their sacrificial animal there, or they would appoint someone who is in the haram to sacrifice it on their behalf, as we're going to find out. وَهُوَ مُسْتَحَبٌ لِكُلِّ حَاجٍ وَلِكُلِّ مُعْتَمِرٍ. And this type of sacrifice, هدي التطوع, the recommended, the voluntary sacrifice, is recommended for every pilgrim and every person performing umrah. اقتداء بالنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, following the example of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. فقد أهدى 100 بدنة في حجة الوداع, who offered 100 camels during حجة الوداع. When the Prophet performed Hajjatul Wada', he sacrificed, or he offered 100, and he sacrificed 63 of these with his own hands, and Ali radiallahu anhu sacrificed the remaining 37. So any additional sacrifices is mustahab. Likewise, one for the mufrid is mustahab, and likewise for the mu'tamir, the person performing umrah during these days, it's also recommended. And the one who is not a pilgrim is also recommended. So it's generally recommended for everyone to perform هدي التطوع. هدي التطوع. ويستحب الأكل منه, and it's recommended to eat from it. لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أمر من كل جزور ببضعة فطبخت وأكل منها وشرب من مرقها. So when the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, he sacrificed his 100 sheep, he ordered that from every animal that some of it was left and saved. It was cooked and he ate from it and he drank from its soup. And this hadith is reported by Muslim. So eating from this sacrifice as well as the first one, it's recommended. وَالْبَضْعَةُ الْقِطْعَةُ مِنَ اللَّحْمِ, and bad'a, it is a piece of meat. ويجوز لغير المحرم أن يبعث هدايا إلى مكة لتذبح بها تقربا إلى الله ولا يحرم عليه شيء مما يحرم على المحرم. Yeah, this is what we mentioned. The person who is not a pilgrim or mu'tamir, it's permissible for him likewise, even though he's outside of the haram, to send his sacrificial animal to the haram so that it is slaughtered. So that it's slaughtered and its meat is distributed to the poor of the haram, an offering. This is also recommended. And the Prophet ﷺ did this in the year before his Hajj, in the 9th, when he sent Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Abu Bakr performed Hajj. He sent with him some of his sheep to the haram with him for Abu Bakr to slaughter. So this is where the scholars, they took as evidence in the hadith of Aisha reported by Bukhari and Muslim, that he sent sheep with Abu Bakr to the haram to be slaughtered on his behalf. So this is why we're saying that it's sunnah for a person who is outside of the haram to send sheep or camel or cow, whatever sacrificial animal he chooses, that it is sent there and slaughtered and its meat is distributed to the poor of the haram. Or you can appoint someone who is in the haram to slaughter it on your behalf. And this is done in order to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an act of worship. So this is the third type. The third type is the general voluntary slaughtering. The fourth one, Hadiyun Nadhr. Hadiyun Nadhr is where a person, he vows to offer a sacrificial animal. وهو ما ينذره الحاج تقربا إلى الله عند البيت الحرام. And this is the hadi which the pilgrim, he makes a vow upon himself to slaughter at the Bayt al-Haram, at the sacred house. ويجب الوفاء بهذا النذر, and it's wajib upon him to fulfill this vow due to the saying of Allah, statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, due to the statement of Allah, ثم ليقضوا تفثهم وليوفوا نذورهم. then let them, the pilgrims, perform the acts of cleansing and grooming. وَلْيُوفُوا نُذُورَهُمْ, and fulfill their vows. وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْأَكْلُ مِنْ هَذَا الْهَدِي. This type of hadi, sacrificial animal, it's not permissible for one to eat from it. The one who vows to sacrifice the animal for Allah's sake, it's not permissible for him to eat any of it. So we have 4 types. 2 we can eat from and 2 we cannot eat from. So Hadi Tamattu al-Qiran, you can eat from it. Hadi al-Jubran, the one expiatory one, you cannot eat from it. The voluntary sacrifice, you can eat from it. The Hadi al-Nadhr, sacrificial animal that's vowed to be slaughtered, you cannot eat from it. And from these we have the first one. If the person is unable, then he has to fast 10 days, 3 while in pilgrimage and 7 when he returns back. طيب. وقت ذبح الهدي, the time for slaughtering the hadi. When does one have to slaughter the hadi? هدي التمتع القران يبدأ وقته من بعد صلاة العيد يوم النحر إلى آخر أيام التشريق. So the first type, the hadi that is slaughtered by the pilgrim who is doing Hajj al-Tamattu and the one who is doing Hajj al-Qiran, the timing for that slaughter begins after Salatul Eid, Eid al-Adha, the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Once a person, he has prayed his Eid Salah, after that, that's when it begins. So from that point onwards until the last day of Ayyam al-Tashriq, so Maghrib on the 14th of Dhul Hijjah. So you have from after Salatul Eid on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah up to sunset on the 14th of Dhul Hijjah. This is the timing for slaughtering in the case of the Mutamatti and the Qarin. طيب. أما ذبح فدية الأذى واللبس فحين فعله. As for the Fidyatul Adha, remember Fidyatul Adha, we mentioned that was the first and the main prohibition that we took the other time, where we said if a person shaves their head off or trims their nails or wears fitted clothing, uses perfume, covers the head, the fidya that they have to offer is one of 3 options. The first one, to fast 3 days, feed 6 poor people, or slaughter a sheep. So slaughtering a sheep here, this Fidyatul Adha, if you choose to slaughter a sheep, when does the timing begin and when does it end? أما ذبح فدية الأذى واللبس فحين فعله وكذلك الفدية الواجبة لترك واجب. This type of slaughtering, the expiatory slaughtering, it begins as soon as the person, he falls into the prohibition or he leaves off the obligatory act. So as soon as he commits the prohibition or leaves off the obligatory act, that's when the timing begins. وَأَمَا دَمُ الْإِحْصَارِ فَعِنْدَ وُجُودِ سَبَبِهِ. As for the sacrifice that's offered because a person is obstructed from completing his Umrah or Hajj, and then this one also is as soon as the person is obstructed, that's when he offers this sacrifice. وَهُوَ شَاتٌ, and it is a sheep, أو سبع بدنة, or a 7th of a camel, أو سبع بقرة, or a 7th of a cow. طيب. لقوله تعالى فإن أحصرتم فما استيسر من الهدي. If you are obstructed, then sacrifice whatever sacrificial animal you can afford. So this is in terms of the timing. مكان الذبح now. Where does the slaughtering take place? Where does the slaughtering take place? Generally, it takes place within the haram. But let's read. هدي التمتع القران السنة أن يذبحه بمنى. The hadi of التمتع, the mutamatti and the qarin, their sacrificial animal, the sunnah is to slaughter it at Mina. Mina is a specific place within the haram. So in the haram generally is permissible, but specifically in Mina this is the sunnah. وإن ذبحه في أي جزء من أجزاء الحرم جاز. But if he slaughters it in any area of the haram, then it's also permissible and it's acceptable. طيب. So mutamatti and qarin, the sunnah is to slaughter it in Mina, and this is where the slaughtering takes place. وكذلك فدية ترك الواجب وفعل المحظور فلا تذبح إلا في الحرم. Likewise, the sacrificial animal, that's the expiatory sacrifice for leaving off an obligatory act or committing a prohibition, this is also done at the haram. عدا هدي الإحصار, except for the hadi, the sacrificial animal that's offered due to a person being obstructed from completing their Hajj and Umrah. This one, فَيَذْبَحُهُ فِي مَوْضِعِهِ, is offered at the locality where the obstruction takes place. Where he's been obstructed and he stopped to continue on, that's where he slaughters it, wherever that may be. أما الصيام فيجزئه في كل مكان. As for fasting, then he can fast wherever he wishes. والمستحب أن يصوم 3 أيام في الحج و7 إذا رجع إلى أهله. And what's recommended is to fast 3 days during Hajj and 7 when he returns to his family. What's correct is that it's wajib for a person to fast the 3 days during pilgrimage. It's not mustahab. What's correct is that it's wajib. لقوله تعالى فإذا أمنتم فمن تمتع بالعمرة إلى الحج فما استيسر من الهدي فمن لم يجد فصيام 3 أيام في الحج و7 إذا رجعتم تلك 10 كاملة. The ayah that we mentioned previously. This is the evidence that a person has to fast 3 days during pilgrimage and 7 upon his return if he cannot find a sacrificial animal. And this is in the case of the person who is performing at-tamattu' and qiran in their case. As for the person who is obstructed from continuing with his Hajj and Umrah, this person, if he cannot find a sacrificial animal, then there is no alternative. He doesn't have to fast, because there is no evidence in his case that he has to fast. طيب. ويستحب أن يذبح الحاج بنفسه. It's recommended for the pilgrim to slaughter by himself if he is able. وإن أناب غيره فلا بأس بذلك. But if he appoints someone else to do it on his behalf, then that's also okay. ويستحب أن يقول عند الذبح بسم الله اللهم هذا منك ولك. And it's recommended for him to say while slaughtering Bismillah, to mention the name of Allah. It's wajib for a person to mention the name of Allah when slaughtering. And then it's recommended Allahumma hadha minka wa laka. This is from you and this is for you. أما شروط الهدي فهي شروط الأضحية نفسها. As for the conditions for the sacrificial animal, the one that's going to be slaughtered here as Hadi, فهي شروط الأضحية نفسها. They are the same conditions as the conditions for Udhiyah. And the difference between Hadi and Udhiyah, the main difference is Udhiyah can be slaughtered anywhere, although the timing for them is the same. So they begin after the Salatul Eid until the last day of Ayyam al-Tashriq. The same timing, but the location for slaughtering is different. Hadi has to specifically be within the Haram. Udhiyah can be anywhere. There's a chapter that's going to come. Not the next chapter, but the 5th chapter is going to speak about Udhiyah. So what they're saying here is the Udhiyah sacrifice and the Hadi sacrifice, they have the same conditions. These 3 conditions. And يكون من بهيمة الأنعام, that they have to be from a specific category of animal, and that is the cattle, either a camel, cow, or sheep. So that's the first condition which they have in, and they share. The second condition which they both share in, أن يكون خاليا من العيوب التي تمنع الإجزاء كالمرض والعور والعرج والهزال, is that the animal has to be free from certain defects. التي تمنع الإجزاء. They have to be free from these defects which make them unacceptable for slaughtering. So there are some, the Prophet ﷺ has clarified in the hadith of Al-Bara ibn Azib that the animal that's going to be offered as sacrifice must be free from 4 defects. And the 4 defects is that it's free from being blind in one eye, free from illness, free from being crippled or lame, and al-huzal is where it's the marrow, the bone marrow it has no bone marrow, and it's very fragile. So there are certain defects that the sacrificial animal must be free from. And obviously the better, the meatier, the stronger the animal, the greater the reward. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. You will not attain piety until you give from that which you love yourselves. So that's the second thing, that it has to be free from certain defects. The third one, أن تتوافر فيه السن المشروع, that the sacrificial animal has to fulfill a certain age. So in the case of the ibil, 5 sanawat, it has to be 5 years or more. The baqar, the cow, has to be 2 years or older. Al-ma'iz sana, the goat, has to be 1 year or older. وَالضَّأْنُ 6 أشهر, and the sheep is 6 months or older. So they have to fulfill these conditions that have been met, and these are the same conditions for Hadi and Adhiyah. طيب, بارك الله فيكم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.